Okay, so now that you've had a little bit of historical background, social background about the Middle Ages, we're going to get into one of the seminal works from the period, which is referenced in everything as I noted in class, Dante's Inferno, which is part one of the Divine Comedy. Now, the other two parts are Purgatorio and Paradiso, which mean purgatory and paradise or heaven in Italian. However, the first part is about Dante's journey into hell. And I have a little note at the bottom of this slide that most of the prints are by the artist Gustave Doré, which may be familiar to you if you've taken art history. He did a bunch of famous prints for a lot of different literary works, Inferno being one of them. Okay, if you need to pause this slide here and copy down these two definitions or add them to your literary terms list, it'll be on your final. So a comedy, it's called the Divine Comedy simply because it's a medieval narrative that ends happily. So it starts bad. It'll start with Dante being lost in his life's journey, and it ends well when he finally reaches heaven. Whereas a tragedy, on the other hand, was a medieval narrative that ends unhappily. So starts from good and goes to bad, simply the opposite. Right, a little bit about the author. This is him right here in one of his famous poses. So his name is Dante Alighieri. He was born in Florence, in Italy. And as we study Dante, we could go off on a bunch of different tangents. We could look at the political turmoil during the time. We can look at the morality during the time. We could look at more deeply into detail in the historical context. However, it just should be of note in regards to politics that in Italy it was chaotic. There were these two factions, the blacks and the whites, nothing to do with race, but those were just the two parties. And what happened was, long story short, Dante, he left the country on vacation, and while he was gone, the opposing political party took control in a coup. And when he came back, they stripped him of his lands, his political clout, his wealth, and he was exiled from his home country. He had to leave. So while he was in exile, this is when he wrote Inferno. And part of the Inferno, despite the fact that it's a major work that talks about morality, he actually placed a lot of living people in his story, in his hell. And so as Dante, the character, journeys through hell, he runs into a lot of the political leaders that ousted him from his post. So it's kind of like, in a way, he's getting back at a lot of those people in a vengeful manner. It should also be of note that Inferno was written in Italian. The major language during the time, everything was written in Latin. So he was writing in the voice of the people, which is why so many of Italy's people read Inferno, because it was in their native language. It would be akin to, I don't know, local authors writing in Pidgin or in Hawaiian, something for the people. One other thing I'm going to note here is the principle of the Trinity. So Dante was a very religious person, and because the literature focused a lot on Christianity, this reflects that. So you'll see this idea of threes come up a lot. There'll be three beasts that Dante encounters. 3 times 3 is 9. There's 9 circles. So there's 3 parts, 33 cantos. It's written in terza rima, which is 3-line stanzas. So you'll see that interspersed throughout the literature. And the last bullet here is about Beatrice or Beatrice, and this was the love of Dante's life. He met her once when he was younger, and he immediately fell in love with her. And although they married other people, she continued to be the muse in his writing, and she is ultimately in the story where Dante, the character, strives to be with her in heaven. So he couldn't be with her in life, so in his story is actually where he gets to be with her. Okay, so just a brief summary. It is the Divine Comedy, and you know why it's called comedy now. Obviously divine because it deals with spirituality. So he travels through these 9 circles or 9 levels of hell, ultimately to reach Satan and emerge on the other side of the world and get to purgatory and eventually paradise. So each circle represents an area where people go who have committed various levels of sin. So depending on the severity of the sin, that's the level of hell you go to, 9th being the most severe. And the upcoming lectures will go into detail about the different types of sins. Okay, so this is another term that I want you to add to your definitions list. It's allegory. So the definition is narrative that takes place on a literal and a figurative or symbolic level. So the example from the poem here that I provided in the middle is that literally Dante, the character, he goes on a journey and travels through hell, purgatory, and paradise before reaching God in Beatrice. So this is symbolic of the journey that every person must face or was about to face during the medieval period or Middle Ages towards reaching God or salvation. To further exemplify in red here on this slide, the very first lines of the poem read, "Midway in life's journey, I went astray from the straight road and woke to find myself alone in a dark wood," how shall I say. So this is Dante, the character, speaking. And I want to point out that it says midway. So like all epic poems, it begins in medias res, or in the middle of things. So literally, Dante, the character, he's on this journey and he went astray from a path or a literal road that he was on. And he was in this dark wood, which is, again, literally a wood. So symbolically, going astray from this straight road means that everyone at some point in their life, they go or veer off the righteous path. And that path towards salvation sometimes you get distracted from. So the dark wood that you find yourself in sometimes is this depressive state, perhaps a dark time where you don't know what's going on, perhaps you have sinned. So that's the symbolic level that this poem operates on. So almost everything has a literal and a symbolic level and represents allegory. And at the very bottom here, I have a little cultural note that, I mean, you can think of it like the kauna of this particular poem. So it means one thing, but there's a hidden meaning as well. So that's allegory. You don't need to copy anything for this slide, but I put it here to show you all the different allusions and characters that Dante has in Inferno. So as an epic poem, I mean, it's pretty epic in scale. And every writer, as I mentioned in class, always patterns themselves after what came before and also references works that came before as well. One, to show they're smarts and they're well read. And in Dante's case, he used it to connect to the people because people would know these stories and actual people that were in the poem. So here he has a bunch of different classical writers. Homer, Virgil, of course, who was his idol, is in the poem. There's mythological characters and creatures. There's tons of biblical references, obviously, because the literature from the Middle Ages represents the move from paganism to Christianity, as well as a bunch of historical figures from his own time. So this particular slide shows you the allusions and major characters that we're going to be covering in our reading, or our abridged reading of Inferno. So the first one is Paula and Francesca. So these are two lovers that are referenced a lot in the Renaissance, particularly by Shakespeare. And we'll read about them in the Circle of the Lustful. The second one is Filippo Argente, and he was one of the historical figures that was alive during Dante's day, and he was part of the opposite political party that Dante was a part of, and he had a part in exiling Dante. So Dante, to get revenge, he places him in a level of hell, so he has the last laugh there. You also recognize a lot of the fallen warriors of Troy, including Achilles. Yep, Achilles is in hell. And lastly on this slide is Beatrice, who, if you remember, was Dante's early love. He immediately fell in love with her, love at first sight, but he could never be with her except in his poetry. So her name, Beatrice, in Italian, translates to bringer of blessings. She's the one who sends a message down to Dante to follow his guide and go to heaven. So even in his poetry, she represents salvation and ultimate love. So that's kind of the allegory of her figure. And one of the most famous characters in history is Satan. So you can see here he is represented by having 3 heads. So here we see that principle of the Trinity pop up again. And if you can kind of see, each one of the heads are chewing on one of the greatest sinners in history. And so we'll learn a little bit more about who those people are towards the end of Dante's journey. So before we begin our journey into hell, think about the other depictions that you've seen, because most of our modern day interpretations of hell all come from Dante's fictional work, Inferno. So here we have Hellboy, we have a movie by Robin Williams, What Dreams May Come. It's actually his journey, loosely based on Inferno. his journey into hell to get his wife back, Diablo, and video game Inferno that I showed you guys in class. All right, so this is how the poem starts, and we'll read about this in class. So Dante, right, the character, he starts by climbing the Mount of Joy, and his goal is to reach the top of this mountain. Again, think about the literal and symbolic level that this operates on. So as he's traveling towards this mountain, he's stopped in the woods by three beasts, the first of which is the she-wolf of incontinence, and she's blocking his path to the top of that mountain. And he turns around and he doesn't know what to do. So in order to reach paradise, he's confronted by Virgil. And Virgil appears to him, and if you recall, Virgil was one of Dante's literary heroes, and in the poem he represents reason and logic. It was somebody who Dante, the author, looked up to. So in his poetry, in Inferno, he created a guide. So Virgil tells Dante, look, I know where you're trying to go. Beatrice has sent me to guide you. And Dante says, oh, you know who Beatrice is? She's the love of my life. And Virgil says, of course I know who that is. She sent me here. And so Dante agrees to follow Virgil. And Virgil tells him, look, there's no easy way to the top of that mountain, or no easy way to heaven. I need to show you another way. You need to see hell first before you can appreciate heaven. So allegorically, for the people in the Middle Ages, they lived such crappy lives that they needed some hope that there was something better. So no matter how bad your life was, there was always redemption. So this is why Dante must go through hell first. So Virgil guides him and tells him, look, I know a secret path. Let's go this way. And it's to the river of Acheron. And if you recall, there is a ferryman that guards the gates of hell and can get him across. And this particular person is Charon, the blind ferryman of Hades. So think back to your 9th grade mythology. So they place the coin in his hand. He brings them across the river, and they reach the shores of right before the gates of hell. So before we begin our journey into hell, I want you to copy down this word, contrapasso. And it's Italian, and it doesn't really have an English translation. However, the closest one is counter-suffering. So it's the idea that for every sin that someone commits in life, there is an equal and opposite punishment for that particular sin that that person must endure for eternity in hell. So this little picture at the bottom will be representative of Dante and Virgil, and it'll kind of give you a visual of where they are in regards to the levels of hell in the next presentation.